make sure that the design was in line with the desired pedagogy to take place within that space. And so in thinking about how to achieve those kind of designs, do you all have any consensus design principles that you try to follow? To apply to unique situations like large enrollment spaces, like informal learning spaces, just to guide that work that you're doing?
Yeah, it depends, of course, on the school. There's a lot of discipline-specific pedagogy approaches that the schools often feel very passionate about, and there's a lot of research to support what they're trying to do. So that drives a lot of it. I would say an overall theme at Pitt is what we would just call very broadly active learning. There's a lot of POGIL instruction that happens. If you're familiar with POGIL, it's process-oriented guided inquiry learning. And it's just a very active kind of pace where you talk about a problem. There's a fellow in chemistry who's doing a fantastic job of this. You do 5 minutes of talking about something, and then they form groups and do work on worksheets, and he runs around. It takes a lot of energy to teach this way, I should say, to go to visit all the groups that are working on it, then 5 more minutes of talking about it as a big group, and then break. It's just constant back and forth, and letting the groups work together. So any kind of active learning, our School of Engineering does a great job of this too. It's a big part of their process. But that's the overall framework with which we look at most of our classrooms, whether they're large enrollment or just a more normal class size of, say, 30 to 40, 50 kids. I would say that we are doing a good job of setting up the spaces. We probably need to start doing a better job of getting more involved in getting the faculty to really think about their lesson planning, their delivery of the instruction, and how to do the active learning in the class. Because it is such a big mind shift for a lot of faculty to teach this way. And you cannot really show them one time and then abandon them, but you have to spend time with them throughout the course of a semester or a year or two, and really give them feedback and help and support them and make them feel like they're not just placed in this really nice looking space that's awfully nice to look at and to teach in, but without any real support and guidance on how to use that space. We're finding that that's where we need to put more resources, is in the support once we get the space in there, so that active learning really can happen.
So does anybody here have a background in theater at all? Have you done high school theater, anything like that? Okay, a few hands. Right. All right. No, I saw a couple back there, and a couple nods. I like to think of all space as stage and props and things like that. It tells you what should happen there. So if you come to a space like this, right? So I'm sitting in a throne, right? I'm sitting in the special place, and you're all the audience looking at me. I mean, I'm not saying that because I'm conceited. I'm just saying that because that's what this space is telling you. You guys are here to learn from us. Now, if we were all seated in a circle and we had the other LTC people here, it would seem like more of an equal sharing. Like you guys would be expected to share your ideas as well as us. We would be expected to ask you questions as much as you're asking us or to each other. So a space really tells you what should happen in that space. It's either encouraging cultural rituals or it's discouraging cultural rituals. So if you have this is Greenlaw from UNC, and this used to be a typical tiered classroom with all the seats facing the front, and they said we want to change that. And the standard thinking in learning space design world is that if you have a tiered classroom, it's just impossible. You just can't really do much with that. Maybe you could turn to your peer in those seats that force you, the spring-loaded seats that force you to keep facing the front. But it's really difficult to do. So they just put in these tiers, they put in a little platform, so each one is like a step-down mode, and these are all swivel chairs. Now the students can still swivel them to the front, and that's nice for somebody who just wants to lecture, like let them do that. But if you want them to collaborate, they can all face each other. So even the fact that these seats are on wheels tells students that it's okay to talk to the person next to you. It encourages that behavior. They also have these screens on the side, so if a pod of students wants to project what they're doing on a local screen, or if you want to if you're teaching, you want to control all of the screens to show the same thing, you can do either of those. So that tells you it's okay for you to share information with the rest of the group. So, you know, I just look at it from a kind of a theater perspective or a cultural anthropology perspective to get a lot of insights. You have to think about what is the experience of somebody who, like you, right now, are seated at tables, you know, looking this way versus what if you all turn and start talking to each other.
And I think for where I can speak for the Learning Spaces Committee is we're just starting the discussion about design and how we create those designs. We're bringing in a design company to assist us to create 3 or 4 classroom standards to help facilitate the conversation with faculty and other people in the spaces about how to teach, how to set up. You know, there's multiple chair types, there's multiple desk types, to kind of put some standards around the classroom, so if a faculty member leaves one space and goes to another, that they feel comfortable and they know what they're walking into. At the same time, they can be flexible or lecture style, just as you said. So we hope that this design process will create the next stage and encourage that flow.
The other thing I'll add to that is there is a lot of value of bringing students who have taken a class in a certain room, asking them to sit in one of the seats and say, well, you know, tell me what it's like to take a course in this room. And they'll say all sorts of things you never really thought about, like the sight lines are terrible. Whenever the faculty member is writing on the whiteboard, it's behind the big podium and I can't see anything. Or same thing with a faculty member. They'll say that this podium is so large, it's nice that I can lay out my stuff, but I feel like it's a barrier, so I can't really talk to my students. Or you know, again, a faculty member with a disability will say, you know, this is great, but I can't get up to the platform. I can't really see what's being projected, so I have to turn around and look all the time to see where my presentation is. And it's just incredibly valuable.
One factor that I think we didn't overlook is that a lot of the designs that work very well for interaction and collaboration during class don't work very well for taking tests. So it might not be a bad idea as part of the course planning process to think about in advance before you get to that first test of the semester, what is going to happen when you have a bunch of students sitting inches from each other,
Yeah.
which works wonderfully for collaboration, but may not be optimized for individual testing.
Yep.
Are there fallback locations or spillover locations so you free up every other seat or something like that?
Yep. The Steelcase, I know they have some furniture options that have built-in whiteboards, like personal whiteboards. They can also be put up as privacy screens. Also, we just visited the Exeter Academy, and they teach in the round. So it's almost all large round tables. But whenever it comes time to take tests, everybody faces the side, and then there's a pull-out board. And so I would be facing this way, you would be facing that way, that person would be facing that way. So it's like a circular thing around. There's, you know, you can't really see. The only thing you can see is the back of the other person's body. So you're right, though. That is good consideration.
And then there's always the cheap way, which is the manila folders that you can stand on. Right? And seriously, there's always that too. That creates little private spaces. So how have you guys gotten feedback? You mentioned, you know, hearing from students. What processes have you used to get feedback from the faculty who teach in the space and from the students who would be in the space to guide you in designing a new learning space?
I've already gone. So that's good.
Okay, well, we do focus groups with the students and with the faculty, but we also do a lot of observations. We have a whole sheet that we've designed that we take into the classroom. It's our active learning scorecard where we divide the room into different quadrants, or depending on the shape of the room, and measure how many interactions happen, the kind of interaction that happens, and then we give a report back to the faculty to say, this is what's happening, you know, this is kind of a dead zone right here for whatever reason, and we measure all those things. And sometimes it's different depending on what they're teaching and how they're teaching. There are different kinds of interactions. Different people define active learning very differently as well. An active learning experience in one discipline might be very different from another. And that's okay, we try to incorporate that. But we find that that's the best way to do it, is to get a lot of different data sources. It's good to hear what they think is happening, But it's also good to go in and actually see with your own eyes and record what's happening to make sure that that is in fact what's unfolding. We think we might be doing something, but and maybe that is happening in the first third of the class, but the other 2/3 of the class, that doesn't actually happen. And you don't know until you go in there and actually watch it unfold.
Joe, is that similar to the documentation that Minnesota has created for doing that, or is it something unique that you all have done?
It's loosely based on that. We started with that. They do a lot of great work at the University of Minnesota. You should definitely check out their publications. It's fantastic. And we took that and designed our own version based on the unique needs of the spaces that we're in. Because we're not where University of Minnesota is with this. We have some interim steps that we have to take, but it is based on that work.
Okay.
Yeah.
And for us in the Learning Spaces Committee, it's we are collecting data for the rooms that have new technology in our flexible spaces to see what kind of feedback and what kind of adjustments we need to do as the Learning Space Committee gets going and starts heading down the path of design. One of our spaces, Wingate 314 and Wingate 209 or 210, I believe, is a small collaborative space with multiple monitors, and we've collected 2 semesters of data from those questions from a professor who's been really proficient in that space. And it's interesting to see the data from the students, and you can actually learn what professors are using the space the way it should be used and what professors are just teaching lecture because of the way they answer the questions that we ask. So we also are starting to form our own questions.
Yes.
As the theories about the learning spaces are evolving, and sometimes the funding for renovating a space can be kind of a long process. We're likely to be getting the funding the next fiscal year and so forth. How do you protect against building a great space that was great last year and now not great?
Yeah, I would say that we just try not to go too crazy with something that's just so cutting edge and untested, but to really base everything on what's been proven to work and to not go too far out on a limb. Pitt, institutionally, and John can confirm this for me, is pretty conservative. It's, Pitt isn't the institution that's going to try out the latest and greatest educational technology fad or those kinds of things. We still use Blackboard. I think it's really served us well in a lot of ways because we haven't done a lot of fads or things that weren't really proven. We sort of wait to see, like, does this work? Let's look at the data. Let's look at several years of data. And then when it's proven to work, we're like, okay, that's what we're going to do because this is shown to work. So I think that's allowed us to avoid that kind of mistake.
Our last design lasted 4,000 years.
That's a pretty good track record, right?
What about your budget cycle? How does that play a role? What is your budget cycle for renovations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, and it depends. So we have the course incubator thing that we talked about, which is, I don't honestly know what the budget is for that. I'm waiting to see. I guess we'll find out on what gets funded. But then we have the traditional classroom renovations, and I don't honestly know what that number is either. I will say that we do have to take into consideration some of the things that you all talked about before. There's not just the financial constraints, which we all deal with, but the constraints of making sure that while these rooms are being renovated, we have places to hold these classes because they can't be used. And at Pitt, we have a lot of space, but it's not really great space. So sometimes those kids get put into a class that's not ideal just for a semester or for a year while we get the space the other space fixed up nicely. Like there's one of my favorite professors there is teaching a 400 student class in intro psychology in the floor below me, which is a big auditorium that was designed for like theater, true theater stage. And so the first time I went to work with her and observe her class, the kids were going up against the wall where there were these stacked things with cushions on them, and it was a desk lap thing that you had to hold. And I'd never seen that before. I thought, what are these, meditation cushions? This is what's going on here? But no, that's just, and so it was horrible for that and many other reasons. But she's an excellent instructor. She made it work as best as she possibly could. But now those kids are out of there. They're back in a good classroom. It's all okay. But sometimes we do have to have temporary stopgap measures that are not ideal until we get things designed the way they should be.
I wanted to ask about, we have a lot of of space, in particular in our library here, that is designed for more informal, active learning, so not necessarily course-based or in a classroom, but trying to encourage students to interact as they study informally. Do you have experience with those kinds of spaces as well?
So this is what I was reviewing, is my report on informal learning spaces that I did.
Maybe later, Alan.
Yes, and this is from 2012, I believe, but a lot of these principles still hold true. But we looked at, what we did was we looked at spaces where students were gathering and where they weren't gathering. And then we just made, I have qualitative research background, so we just made notes about their behaviors and were they working individually, were they working collectively, were they using technology or not. We asked a couple of them, why do you like this space? And we found some really interesting things with informal spaces. So, for example, the New School of Business at Penn State has a first floor that is packed with students all the time. There's flexible seating, it's really comfortable, but students are working individually and in groups. The same kind of space exists on the second floor. It's vacant. And the reason is that we found is that the faculty offices are on the second floor. So if they're seated right outside the faculty offices, it seems like they're waiting for an appointment or they're waiting for the principal to come out and smack their hand or something. It wasn't their space. The first floor was their space. The second floor was faculty space. Huge difference. Same thing with our library. Our library space is so packed, especially going up to midterms and finals. The first floor completely full. We took out some shelving on the second floor, put in informal spaces, and started getting complaints like crazy about the Wi-Fi. And the thing is, the Wi-Fi on the second floor was designed for shelves of books, which don't use a lot of Wi-Fi. Now, imagine that you now have, the quadruple the student population just working together, and they're all on their computers. The Wi-Fi is now broken. The Wi-Fi didn't change, but the perception of the Wi-Fi and the necessity for that. So, there are some things that we look for, but the library is a great common space. It belongs to everybody. It's not that business students would walk in there and feel like they don't belong because it's a communications building. It's a library. Everybody goes to the library. So that was great. But if there were a lot of faculty services on the second floor, maybe they wouldn't feel as comfortable anymore. Also, there's a differentiation. The first floor is noisy. The second floor is a quiet space. And so you have different students gravitating to either floor and then switching during the semester depending on what their needs are. But we also asked students why they use those spaces instead of the ones in the residence halls. And what they told us was, if I'm there, I'll run into my friends, they'll ask me to do something, and the library is where I go to get work done. And we're like, all right, this just totally makes sense. So feel free to just talk to me, because I probably know more about that than I do about classroom design.
I would just say everything Alan said, and add to that, another grant that we're working on is, I won't name the department because I don't want to jinx their grant, but they're looking to build this sense of community in their department, which is very, very large. And so they're looking a lot at these informal spaces, and we did almost exactly what Alan has described. We looked at where the students were going to sit in this very large building, and there's no furniture for them to sit in there, but they're just sitting on the floor.
Yep.
And it's very clear that they want to hang out there. That's where their department cohort resides, and they need to be there. And so we're going to accommodate them based on where they're sitting on the floor or on the old heater or radiator or whatever is in that building. And it's going to look really cool when they're done. And I think the faculty are excited about this sense of community that will build around their department, which the kids also want. So those informal learning spaces are really critical.
Yep.
And for us at Wake Forest, I think if you all have been in Kirby and noticed the transition from, into the math department or out of the math department into the other, that open space that they created there, if you walk through it, it used to be blank and desolate. Now there's people there all the time. And then if you think about like Tribble Hall, when you first walk in Tribble, there's people always sitting in seats. I think if we would do something in that space and create a more open feel, that they would automatically gravitate there. So I think we have the same things happening, we just need to recognize it.
Kind of in that same line, Have you had any luck at either of your schools with transitional space, outside of those big classrooms where you put in seating where the faculty member could continue a conversation with your students? I mean, so many of our academic spaces have such small classrooms, hallways and spaces like that. There's not a lot of that. But
Yeah.
any big wins on that?
I wouldn't say that we've had faculty use those spaces, but certainly we have students either between classes, having a discussion after class, having a group meeting right after class, something like that, using those, what you're calling transitional spaces. I call them classroom porches, because they're kind of like, you're not really in the house, you're kind of in the gathering space, you're in that nexus, that crossroads between spaces. So, yeah, and that's I think what this first floor of the business school was, because it was faculty offices and classrooms. So students, as they would leave class, or as they would be entering class, they would run into other students or check their notes or something, and need that space to kind of pause and get something. But there are other factors of success too in those areas, like having a cafe nearby, allowing food and drink, being okay with that. And then the constant struggle with janitorial staff around whether we do a reset or not. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but with informal learning spaces, especially if you have mobile furniture, do you reset it to the same thing every day, or do you just let it go organically? So one way, you're kind of struggling against what the students actually want, and the other way, kind of looks like a mess. So it's a balance. Stain-resistant fabric is also important.
Yes. The only thing I would add to that is we had two faculty just a couple of weeks ago ask me about the very thing you're describing, but we don't have anything really like that yet, but I think we will, because there's a real need for it, and they want that, and it makes perfect sense. So I hope in a couple of years we'll have it.
Okay. I'm going to shift our gear toward the last topic of conversation, and that is supporting faculty teaching in these redesigned spaces. And our panelists have already alluded to this multiple times, actually, and I owe you guys a big high five. You're like promoting work for me. Or maybe not, actually. But support matters, right? And in fact, publications are out there now demonstrating that you have to have the right support for faculty, pedagogical support and technology support, if you're going to actually get the desired effect, the desired impact of your redesigned space in terms of student learning. And if you're curious, I have a few of those recent pubs there at the bottom of my slide. And you can see that even just in this pedagogy space technology framework, right? Space is a piece of it, but if you don't have pedagogy connected with it, if you don't have the technology connected with it, then the space isn't going to do what we need it to do. And so we've got to support faculty once we've created these spaces. And so you guys have mentioned that it's important, but I'm curious how you go about providing that support, the pedagogical support and the technology support. And Britt and I were just chatting earlier about, do you do those things separately? Do you bring those things together? How do you provide that training and support?
Do you want to start or you want to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. It's really something that's evolving for us because we have a history of, I don't want to say convenience, but we have a lot of students. We don't have a lot of space, and so we tend to plug students and classes into spaces based on schedules and making sure we can fit the 325 kids in a space that's going to work, etc. And so we're really having to shift our model completely to say, this is what this space is really good at and really good for. Now let's go and find the faculty who will teach this way or incorporate this kind of space, this kind of design, etc. And that is a really huge mind shift because it involves lots of stakeholders. Certainly the registrar is a critical stakeholder there because she schedules so many of the large classrooms. And so we have to work very closely with her and her department to make sure that we're putting the right people in the right spaces at the right times, etc. You also have to have conversations with faculty to say, I know that this room that you're teaching in is just 30 feet from your office, but if you come over here and you're willing to walk across campus to this space, you're going to be able to do that really cool thing that you've been wanting to do. So it's having those really candid conversations about, are you willing to do this? Because I can't do it for you in the next 3 years in the space that you're in. But if you're willing to come over here to Posvar Hall, I know it's a bit of a hike, and we do get a lot more snow than Wake Forest, but I promise you're going to be able to do this cool thing. So there's that. And then there's a lot of information sharing over the summer in particular about things that we learn about classrooms, because you do learn things. You think it's going to do this, this, and this, and it does, but oh, by the way, we learned it also does this and this. And you constantly have to share this new information with the faculty. And most importantly, we find, is getting the faculty who have had the success in those rooms to tell their stories and to get those stories out, and to even do demonstrations of what they do in those spaces for other faculty. That has gone a long way for us. And even having meetings when there's not a class going in there, if you meet with faculty a lot like I do all day, have a meeting in one of those vacant classrooms for the 30 minutes that it's available to show it off and incorporate it into what you're doing. That actually goes a long way too, to win them over, and they're like, oh, this is actually pretty cool. I think I would like to teach my so-and-so class in here. And then just not forgetting about them, but constantly following up with them with training and support and asking them what they need. They'll tell you. They'll tell you what they need and what's not working, and you just have to listen to it.
Yeah, so I've tried this model a couple of other ways, a couple different ways, and I'll tell you how we're planning on doing it with the current cycle at University of Miami. So we've accepted faculty who will be teaching more discussion-based courses using a variety of types. Problem-based learning, flipped learning, and the Harkness model, which is kind of everybody around one table. So those faculty have volunteered for it. We're going to form faculty learning communities around each one. So the faculty will talk about their courses, talk about the methods, and then practice that model with each other so they have some hands-on experience. We'll be working with them in the fall semester to redesign their courses, making sure that the objectives and the assignments and everything line up, showing them rubrics, that sort of thing. And then they'll be doing the first implementation next spring. We'll send instructional designers into the classroom to help them model some of the behavior. So with some of these discussion-based models, you need faculty to remember to stop talking. Discussion-based doesn't mean I'm going to talk at students for 45 minutes and I've had my discussion, or that I'm going to, and this is feedback from students, that yes, it's a discussion-based course, but it's still only the same 2 or 3 students who are talking all the time. Everybody else is silent. Now, the faculty thinks that they've achieved their goal, but if you actually map that out, you'll find that they don't, and it also privileges certain groups of students. And it's unconscious, but it might be a first language issue, or a race issue, or a gender-based issue, or even just somebody who shows more enthusiasm or is more extroverted than somebody else. So we want to be very careful about those kind of things. So early on in that semester, we're going to do formative feedback. So basically we're going to come in with a couple of rubrics and just say, all right, based on the discussion that we had today, you interacted with this group of students, why don't you try engaging some people a little bit more? And then just beyond that, helping faculty understand that when they are getting support, it's not transactional. So they're not just saying the projector is broken, somebody comes in and fixes the projector. It's like, this is your person. You will be working with Alan. Alan will be there to support you. Alan will come into your classrooms. Alan is there to help. So they don't feel like it's a burden to be asking me questions, or that they feel embarrassed about admitting that they don't know how to do something, or they might not be doing a method correctly. In addition to the pedagogical and technological support, I'd add like emotional and cultural support. I mean, frankly, faculty don't like to be embarrassed. They might get angry at students for questioning them if they're not used to that. Again, there's a cultural difference there too. We had a faculty member, an international faculty member, who just wasn't used to students asking questions like, well, why is it that way? Like they didn't feel that was appropriate, but in American society it is. So anyway, that's kind of a, what you don't want to do is train faculty at one point and then put them in a foreign land, which is the weird classroom that they've never seen before, and be like, okay, I'm on to my next group of faculty, good luck. Let us know how it goes. you know, because they'll just revert back, they'll panic and revert back to their previous, their comfort zone.
I don't have anything to add to that really because, I mean, in all honesty, the Learning Spaces Committee is discussing that. How do we move forward with that? How do we bring the faculty in, and what part is the implementation? Is that, you know, from beginning to end? Is it just at the end? How do we handhold it through the process? What data do we collect off of it? So we're having those discussions, how we do that.
I'll give you the matrix answer. There is no end.
So Alan, with your faculty learning communities, I'm curious because I'm working on developing something like that to go along with the work that the Learning Spaces Committee is doing. How did you select the faculty that are participating in it now, and how are you funding that?
Funding comes from the provost office. It's you guys are all SACS, right? SACS accredited. So it's part of our quality enhancement plan that we were kind of have to do, based on a lot of institutional data saying that students are asking for more discussion-based learning formats, active learning formats, but specifically discussion-based ones. So there was a big leadership support for that. So provost funding, faculty were selected or asked to participate or volunteered either because they were on the QEP committee, so they were already in the process of generating those ideas. But in some cases, we went out to specifics. We have 11 schools and colleges, so we wanted to get representation from all of the undergraduate ones. So we reached out to somebody in nursing and health studies and said, you know, would you volunteer to be part of this? Now, beyond that, we've had faculty coming out of the Whiteboards saying, you know, I want to do this too, it sounds exciting, I need something fresh to do in the classroom. So our initial round is only 10 in the pilot. We're expanding it from there, but now we're thinking about how do we create mini versions of these that other faculty could try, even if they're not officially part of the program.
And are you running those FLCs for a year, it sounded like, and then supporting afterwards, but as a dedicated community for?
Yeah, especially, we want to be cautious at first, but we're hoping that the faculty who go through the first round can become mentors for the subsequent years. And you said faculty, absolutely. There's, you know, they don't want to listen to somebody with a staff appointment telling them this is the way to teach, but if they hear a good war story from another faculty member, especially, and we're trying to make some bridges too. So we started this discussion-based thing by having the chair of the math department participate. Because if you can do discussion-based learning in math, you can do it in any topic. Like anthropology or psychology or something would be an easy sell, classics or something. But if you can get STEM, then, you know, nobody has an argument. Then the business people can't say, well, it doesn't belong in finance.
So are there any other questions that you all would like to ask the panelists? We have about 5 more minutes in our time, so we'll just open that up to whatever you might like to ask them.
Just a quick one. So I want to, this is sort of a step backwards, I hate to say that, but it is. So the genesis of all this, I think, is what I have a real quick question about. Because I think that thinking about all this together and looking at sort of how it might happen, how it might begin, how good, meaningful sort of learning space changes might begin, I think, talking about dropping faculty into the foreign land, I think that in some cases what we've done, what we ended up having to do is we've ended up creating a desire for change among the administration by supporting faculty, in the sense that we've given them training and new information about these new sort of pedagogical ways, new research-based sort of things that they can do in their classroom, and they go and they come back and say, I don't have any space where I can do the stuff that I want to do now, based on all these wonderful things I've learned. And I think that it seems that sort of push through the sort of the faculty up through their departments and up through the provost seems to be what's making those changes happen. I want to know if that's sort of the way that those processes started for your schools as well, or is there something, where did it come from the top? Is it like the experts who are also teaching you these new sort of pedagogical methods are also telling you that you need these rooms too, or are the faculty really pushing for it based on the fact that they want to grow and improve?
I would say it's a mixture of all of those things. I'm not sure that I can point to any one thing that drives it. Certainly there are a lot of local faculty who are saying just what you said, I want to do this and I cannot do it in my space. And we have a lot of those, and I'm so glad that they're speaking out. But then we also have a lot of really good administrators at the top who realize this is important. We should make it a priority. We should put some money behind this. Let's do it. Let's try to do it the right way. And again, that's why I think it is slow in a good way, and that it really looks at something and examines it and thinks about it for a long time. And then once it figures it out, it's like, okay, we're doing this. The train has left the station. Let's do this. So it's really all of those things, I think, just coming together at once.
You mentioned that the genesis, where does it all come from? So I think we were looking for a sweet spot between what are students asking for, what problems are students defining, what problems are faculty defining, what spaces are underutilized that could be repurposed for something else. What does the research say? What are other institutions doing? What are the university strategies? Like what is the vision? And that's how we created our plan. So we actually found a really nice alignment there. And I would recommend doing that because you're gonna have people meet, and we independent of some other instruments, we surveyed faculty and we surveyed students, and we asked for things like, why would you be hesitant about taking a course like this? Or why would you be hesitant about teaching a course like this? And we got a whole list of issues like the number of students in classes being an issue, what if students don't come to class prepared, what if students are using technology and being social instead of being engaged. So you have to be prepared to have an answer for each of those. And if you do a lot of the reading, there's some excellent books on flipped learning that will say, here are some strategies, 5 strategies for getting students to do the readings before they come to class. Like, just quick checks. This theory, was it related to X, Y, or Z? And if students read the chapter at all, even if they didn't do a debrief, but if they read it at all, they should be able to answer that question. We have an engineering class where if they don't come to class prepared, they're asked to step outside and do the readings or watch the videos or something. Come back in when they're prepared to participate. It seems a little harsh, but the feedback from the students is now if you don't come to class prepared, you feel like you're letting your group down. It's kind of social pressure to do things. So we're still figuring some of this out, but as much as you can, just try to triangulate the various, different perspectives of faculty, staff, administration, research, and I think it'll be an easier sell that way.
Then the last thing that I would add to that is the generation coming from the K through 12 and how they're being taught in the classroom, moving into the higher ed where it might be a step back a little bit. So the generation is actually driving that, and then also you bring in the new professors and the younger generation of professors. They want to have some of this technology because that's the way they learn. So I think that's also the drive behind it.
Okay. I'm going to wrap us up because it is 3 o'clock now. So if you all have additional questions that you'd like to ask, if you want to write them down, if you want to send an email to myself or Brent. We'll try to pick these guys' brains with your questions before they leave, and we'll be glad to answer anything else any other questions you have about learning spaces here at Link. So thank you all very much for being willing to sit on the panel for us.